Welcome, everyone. We are continuing in Clashing Worldviews in the U.S. Supreme Court. We might even finish this book, not today, but soon. So we're in Chapter 9. Just a quick recap for those of you that are maybe visiting for the first time. Chapter 9 deals with what is liberty, what is equality, what is justice from a conservative Protestant standpoint and from a progressive Protestant standpoint. They're very different. And I want to say this clearly, that I think it's important for Christians to understand what is liberty, what is justice, what is equality, because those ideas are manipulated and perverted in our culture. And if we're going to be a light and a witness, even as we share the gospel, but to bring truth and help to people, we need to understand what those things are. Okay, so we've been talking about this. We kind of left off, I believe, in this section here about liberty as progressive Protestants view liberty. Okay, it's very different than the biblical view of liberty. Liberty is really almost an unbridled sense of self-actualization, self-realization. Let the individual desires come out and let's recognize them in law. Okay, again, the sexual revolution is the most obvious example. We left off, I believe, last week with talking about they view the world through a poietic, P-O-I-E-T-I-C view of the world, okay, where the self is such that I must conform reality, I must conform you to my individual desires. So reality must bend to my individual desires, preferences, and feelings. Okay? There's a word for that. It's called expressive individualism. Okay? That has been codified into law. That's what we have, what are called SOGI laws, sexual orientation and gender identity laws. You must, I am a man trapped, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. And by law, you must allow me to go into the woman's bathroom. You must allow me to go into a woman's locker room. You must allow me, to, as a man, to compete in women's sports. That is a poietic view of the world. Biology doesn't matter. My feelings matter, okay? And that is very dominant in our culture today. And the fact that it's being recognized as law is very troubling to conservative Protestants, because as far as I'm concerned, biology is not bigotry. Biology is reality. Right? Yeah. And again, I'll say this, forgive me if I repeat myself, but the folks that embrace this view of the world are going to have a day of reckoning because they live in God's world. And we live in a moral universe. There really are consequences for going outside of God's way of doing things. Sexual sterility is something that is pretty obvious to me, but obviously most, in other words, the homosexual relationships by their very nature and character are sterile. The only way you can produce is you got to manipulate it technologically. And you can only do that so far, and it doesn't work because children need moms and dads. Yeah. They just do. Okay, so anyway, that's what we talked about here. Poiesis, reality is conformed to the self. Hello, my name's not Bruce Jenner, I am Caitlyn Jenner, and you will recognize me as such. If not, you are bigoted and you're attacking me personally. And so what we have within the progressive Protestant view is a confusion between a behavior and an identity. Okay, from a biblical perspective, homosexual conduct is a behavior that's sinful that will keep you from the kingdom of God. You won't go to heaven if you persist in that behavior. But the Bible never equates behavior with selfhood, orientation. The concept of I'm oriented that way, so I can't help myself. I was born that way, does not have any biblical precedent. It is a modern creation from science and psychology when they rejected the biblical worldview back in the 1880s and 1890s in universities. And we are living with the results of it today. Okay, but that's why someone will say, I was born that way. They think that their behavior is identity. It's not. Behavior is an existential thing based on human existence. But it's not, I'm going to get technical, it's not an ontological concept. Ontological refers to being, what we are as human beings. From a biblical perspective, we are made in the image of God, male and female created he, them. Or them, he, anyway, right? And so that is what it means to be a human being. A behavior that violates that is simply that, a behavior. It's a part of human existence, but it does not mean your identity. And that's where the confusion lies in our culture. They are equating behavior with identity. And how dare you come against me because that's hateful, that's mean, that's bigoted. And the reason they say that is, again, because they equate their behavior with identity, with an orientation they cannot change. And from a biblical standpoint, you can change. It says it very clearly in 1 Corinthians 6, when it lists the list of all kinds of sins, one of which is homosexual conduct. And then Paul says right after that, but you were washed, you were, in Christ. In other words, you used to be that way, but you're not anymore. Well, how do I change? It's a choice. It is a willingness to allow the Holy Spirit to change you. It is an acknowledgement that my way is the way of sexual brokenness, and God's way is the way of imago Dei, the image of God, male and female, and I will align myself with that. I will not let my temptation determine reality. I will allow what God's Word says to determine reality and yield to that. And many people don't want to. And okay. And then you get Romans 1, okay? So predictably here, okay? So for a progressive Protestant, if they have a poietic view of the world, conform reality to the self, okay? So on issues such as politics, secularism, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, constitutional interpretation, progressive Protestants consider freedom the right to behave as you desire, provided it doesn't hurt anybody, okay? So they what do they willfully ignore when they say that? Because there's a term for that. This is called minimalist ethics. Do whatever you want, just don't hurt somebody else. That is that's the ethics. That's the way we roll in 21st century America in law. Do whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt me, okay? And that's the view of the libertarians, if you know libertarians. Why doesn't that work from a biblical perspective? Do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody. Think it through. How would you answer that? How would you respond?
Because I love God, I will be hurting God doing whatever I want and not doing what He has said to do.
Okay, but for someone who's a non-believer, and you're trying to create public policy that helps everybody, and I agree with you, and you are correct, from a Christian perspective.
Right.
But from hey, how can we create law that preserves the common good for everyone? Why is that? Why is do whatever you want as long as nobody gets hurt? Why is that a problem? Why is that not good? Take legalized marijuana. You could throw that in. I mean, there's a whole host of things you could throw in. We're talking about sexual stuff, but I mean, you see, legalization of a lot of things.
It does hurt people.
Why? Isn't that called a victimless crime? You've heard that term before?
Yeah.
There's the argument for drug use. Hey, it's a victimless crime. It doesn't hurt anybody because I'm doing it myself. I've chosen to do it, and as long as nobody gets hurt, it's victimless.
How do they know that it's not hurting some? I mean, you take drugs. I guess I don't know about marijuana, but if you live with somebody, you're influencing your family. That's gonna take off, or is it gonna hurt your job? That's hurting. Whatever.
But it's none of their business.
Well, it's none of their business. That I'm hurting you. I'm not gonna show up to work.
My body, my choice, right?
Well, my son's texts, they hurt me.
Who hurt them?
My son's texts to me because
Yeah.
he wants to do what he wants, and I should promote that.
You're talking about
So-
general
Yeah.
society.
Yeah, let me
It's
help
like
a little.
a pebble in the sea.
Well, okay, something that we understand as conservative Protestants, as biblical Christians, is that we live in a moral universe. So there was a natural ecology, pumping chemicals into the river is not good because it affects the ecology. We believe there's a moral ecology. Do we not? God's world. And so that's where we would argue, and you can make that argument true too, even if you don't use scriptures, that hey, we live in a moral universe. What somebody does in the privacy of their own home affects other people in a lot of ways. And so that's how we would respond to that. You feel what I'm saying? In other words, this minimalist ethics assumes we do not live in a moral universe. That what somebody does in the privacy of their own home does not affect other people. Whether it's perverse sexual conduct or pornography or illicit drug use or drunkenness, or we would say, whoa, hold on. What you do affects what you become and what you begin to do in your interaction with other people. See what I'm saying? Is that they tend to ignore that and say that does not apply. Okay?
But as a homosexual, they want to do whatever they want to do, and of course without hurting anybody else, but they do hurt. And I, have said that as a heterosexual, I'm still alive and well. If I went and did anything I wanted to do immorally, I'm hurting other people. It's the same thing. It's the temptation. You don't give in to the temptation.
Yeah. And see, I don't want to digress too much, but if you understand the sexual revolution began with the creation of the pill. Because you've disconnected sexuality from procreation. Okay, you got that. Number two, you've got no-fault divorce. Thank you, Ronald Reagan. In California, he signed that bill into law in 1970, the darling of the conservatives. And so, in other words, there's no-fault divorce. You got no-fault divorce. You've disconnected procreation from sexuality. So the logic of the homosexual movement is, hey, you already got that. You've already disconnected that, and we can continue. That's that logic that continues there. In other words, it's very insidious. Yeah. Here's an expression, again, you probably heard me say this one before, but this is a great expression of how progressive Protestants view liberty. And Justice Anthony Kennedy, in the Supreme Court case Planned Parenthood versus Kennedy, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that basically continued abortion. He said this: at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, of the mystery of human life. And so he used that logic to say the liberty of a woman to decide for herself to terminate a pregnancy is more important than the life of the baby in the womb. Now, I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say it that clearly. But if you've actually read this case, I have. In other words, so what that began to constitutionalize is this really expanded view of liberty. Liberty is the right of each person, right, to define one's concept of existence. What is existence? Existential. Homosexual behavior is existence. It is not identity, it's behavior. So liberty is the right to pretty much self-define what reality is, what is right, what is true, what is wrong, and the courts are not going to prohibit you from doing that. That logic was used in the case in 2003, Lawrence v. Texas, that decriminalized homosexuality. That phrase was used in the case in 2013, U.S. v. Windsor, to strike down the Defense of Marriage Act. That same phrase was used in the 2015 case of Obergefell v. Hodges to make gay marriage the law of the land. Okay, in other words, it's an expanded view of liberty. That's what progressive Protestants will tend to embrace, because they discount what the Bible says, they elevate what science says, they elevate what culture says. God is already embedded in culture, and if that's the way culture is going, then that must be okay. That's where we get, you can do whatever you want in the privacy of your own home, and nobody gets hurt, and it's okay because of that logic. Okay? This is a very significant phrase, because it explains the continuation of abortion rights. It explains the decriminalization of homosexuality in all kinds of ways in our country. It's an expanded view of liberty. Okay? And so again, we're talking through here what would happen if progressive Protestantism and its viewpoint begins to be expressed in equality, liberty, and justice. Okay, this is not a thought experiment. It's already happening. I mean, what you'll see if you've read the last chapter is what has happened is the progressive Protestant view of liberty and equality and justice is happening before our very eyes, and it's replacing the conservative Protestant view of liberty, equality, and justice. Okay, so in other words, this is not so much pie in the sky stuff. We're here. Okay, and so therefore the courts use the due process clause to discover and enforce ideas of substantive due process rights. Okay, again, what is substantive due process? What is due process? You remember?
Yeah, we're good.
Huh?
That everybody has the right to be judged or whatever, have a right.
Okay, to have rights, it means the procedures the government, the state must follow before it takes away your right to life, liberty, property, gun ownerships, religious liberty, right? In other words, it's the steps government must take before it steps in, okay? And so what they're saying here is, and this is constitutional law, so, is the 14th Amendment due process clause. Remember, we've talked about that before, okay? Due process, again, presumes government may not take away your liberty unless you provide a warrant, probable cause, Miranda warnings, a judge, a jury, right? All that stuff. And so they use the liberty within the due process clause. In other words, the assumption is liberty cannot be taken away unless. So they use the due process clause to say, okay, the liberty to express yourself in homosexual conduct cannot be messed with anymore. So we're expanding the due process clause to say that liberty is recognized by the judges. You can spend many fruitless hours looking through the Constitution to see a right for homosexuals conduct, a right to abortion, a right to euthanasia. It's not there. Well, how do they get there? Because this is how they use the liberty within the due process clause. Your liberty cannot be taken away unless the government does this, this, and this, and this, and this. So they use that liberty and say, okay, let's expand it. Now the government cannot prevent this liberty of expression. Does that make sense? What did you just say, Pastor Eric or Professor G, or whichever one you want to call me? I'm saying it is a judicially created right that was not in the Constitution and was never envisioned by the founders. And if it was to become a right, according to the founders, it was meant to be done through legislation. Debate and persuasion within Congress, debate and persuasion within state legislatures. It was never, capital N-E-V-E-R, meant to be done through what they call judicial fiat. Hey, from the bench, I'll legislate and I'll create this. Okay? But for progressive Protestants would say, fine. Because again, expressive individualism. Let's bend reality to my feelings and preferences. That's okay under that concept. Because again, they have a low view of Scripture. So they're not reading the passages like we read that prohibit homosexual conduct. That's not even registering to them. That was back then. Newest is truest, latest, that doesn't apply to today. God's in culture. If people are already doing it, then that must be God. All that drives their
So the
lives.
scales are weighing that way, and Christian rights are going that way. You know what I'm saying? It sounds good for...
Well, it's not just, okay, let me just say clearly, you said Christian rights are going that way, or they're eroding.
Yeah.
Yes, but I would also say the best way to do justice is eroding too. In other words, I would say this very clearly, because I would say it this way to my American National Government class, most of whom are non-believers in a secular setting. Some of you might be really pro-gay this or pro-trans rights this, but let me show you what happens if we go that way. A number of things will happen. Number one, the 10th Amendment, the right of the states, will be surrendered to the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. So in other words, states' rights are going to be gone. Number two, the ability for the American people, through argument and persuasion, to actually have a voice in what social policy the federal government does, that's gone. And number 3, religious liberty is gone too. Because your right to conscientiously object to something you find morally objectionable due to your sincerely held religious beliefs are gone. I said, those 3 things happen. Federalism is surrendered, states' rights, okay? Democracy is surrendered, and your freedom of conscience is surrendered. Are you okay with that now that you have your gay rights? I say it that clearly in class.
That's good.
Okay? For most of the students, they're either glossy-eyed at that point because they're trying to wrestle with all the constitutional law I just threw at them. Or number 2, they bristle because and I try to show them, I said, hear me, okay? I have my own views on homosexuality. I can make it clear to you after class if you want to talk to me. But let me help you out a little bit. If you want those rights, do it the way the Constitution sets it up, through legislation or amendments. And that takes time. That takes a lot of time. And that's how the founders set it up. If you're gonna socially, if you're gonna radically change what marriage is, you can do that after you have spent this time debating in Congress and getting it signed into law. You got to go through three grids. You got to go through the House, you got to go through the Senate, and then you have to have the president sign up for it. And it's got to be upheld in court if it gets challenged. That's how you socially change America. But if you bypass it, you've muzzled 330 million Americans who want to maybe say something about it. Okay? So that's how I present it. In other words, I'm trying to help you, Debbie, because I have to think more broadly than just the Christian view when I'm in a secular setting. And so I'm making the argument not so much where, all those Christians' rights are trampled and they're all sore and they're all upset, even though I firmly believe that and I agree with you. But I try to show you, broadly speaking, from a constitutional standpoint, are you okay with no federalism, no democracy, no religious liberty? Because that's what's happening with this. And so I try to broaden their understanding to help them think this thing through. My name is Professor G and I'm your friend. Because I try to help them think through this stuff. Because they don't. They think, you're so mean. No, let me help you.
Yeah.
But I mean,
because you just altered the structure of the Constitution.
Take away rights from another. That's not equality.
Right, and I think we talked about this in this class, but rights properly expressed do not encroach on the rights of somebody else, or trample upon them, or totally obliterate them. And that is what many on the radical left are trying to do with Christian religious liberty. We want to just, like a steamroller, just flatten it. Because we see them, Christianity, biblical Christianity, as the main enemy for getting our rights through. So that's why they're zeroing in on all these things. It's intentional. Law schools are these Yale and Harvard, they're very intentional. Let's strategically try to pick this stuff apart. And again, and I try to tell people, I said, this is what I say in class, I said, you might not be a religious person, but you still are, because you have sincerely held beliefs on a lot of things that are driven by what is ultimate in your life. Your ultimate may not be God, but it might be at least 3 people, me, myself, and I. And that ultimate belief needs to be respected in law. If you lose freedom of conscience, the state will tell you what to believe. Are you okay with that? Again, I try to keep putting pebbles in their shoe to make their walk uncomfortable. So that even as they walk, thinking LGBT rights and this, it's harder for them to walk comfortably because something is gnawing at them. Hey, wait a minute, yeah. What about those other people? And we should be that way as Christians. Do I want a purely Christian America? The answer is no, I do not. Why don't you? Because there has been no purely Christian America in all of human history. And it doesn't work because we're sinners and we're flawed. But I think the way the framers set this thing up is that, hey, let's create a space where people of all faiths can come in and let that which is true prevail by argument and persuasion, not coercion. Because remember I said this before, in the colonies from 1620 to 1776, other than Rhode Island, there was no religious liberty in Christian colonies, where Baptist pastors were penalized, beaten, thrown into jail, because they weren't Anglicans or they weren't, in other words, that was going on in Christian America. So we got to be really candid and honest about that. So Madison and Jefferson, like, whoa, we can't. Let's make it neutral. Let's create not a sacred public square, all Christian, not a secular public square, all anti-Christian, a civil public square, so that everyone can be free. The First Amendment protects believers, not beliefs. My beliefs can be challenged, your beliefs, fine. But it protects as a believer, your right to have them. That's what the First Amendment is supposed to, that's what it's designed to do. To me, that was like splitting the atom. That's brilliant. No other country in the world has had that. Okay? Anyway. Thoughts, questions? Does that help you a little bit?
I think so.
I'm trying to help you think a little more broadly than, doggone it, our Christian rights are being squashed. I would say, doggone it, the civil liberties of Americans and the structure of our Constitution and federalism is being sacrificed to the steamroller of the Due Process Clause and this manipulation of the Constitution through judicial fiat.
So what I was, is more a symptom of the main reason.
Yeah, because James, if Madison were here, because he's like the father of the Constitution, he contributed most of it. He would go, no, that is not what we're supposed to be doing, And, yeah, okay, let's move on. So equality, okay? Equality for progressive Protestants involves aligning laws with the evolving flow and process of society rather than fixed standards. So what they do is they absolutize equality. So equality is ultimate. So what we have is there is no distinction between right and wrong, good or bad. Everything is equal. Okay? So in other words, everything must be equal. There is no fixed view of what is right about what a marriage is. You don't necessarily own all of your property. All of your money is not so much yours, but must be sacrificed to the common good of the country for the sake of equality. So it goes from moving from equality of opportunity, right? You have the right to learn as much as you want, make as much money as you want, exercise and be in as good a shape as you want, spend as much time with Jesus. In other words, what you become of yourself is your choice, but the government is not going to create that for you. You do it. The government will give you space so you are free to do it, equality of opportunity, but the government is not going to give you things. That's called equality of outcome. Okay? Outcome equality, have you ever heard the term equity right now? Equity. Kamala Harris talks about we need equity. What does that mean? Taking African American people, disadvantaged people, and if it was a race, letting them start 50 yards ahead. Okay, that's equality of outcome. Hey, we want to get the outcome. Everyone finishes at the finish line at the exact same, and so we need to put some people away. Whoa, no. But that's what they would say. Okay, so it's a different view of equality. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of?
Is there anything how in golf they have a handicap?
Huh?
Like in golf they have a handicap?
Yeah, well, yeah, in some respects, yes. Okay, something I teach in my class, I could just tell you, it's a short story by Kurt Vonnegut. You ever heard of Kurt Vonnegut? He wrote Slaughterhouse-Five. He was a POW in World War II, and then he became a writer. He wrote a short story called Harrison Bergeron. I can send you a link. It's 4 pages. It's a futuristic world in which the story begins like this. The year was 2081, and everyone was finally equal. And they were equal because of the 212th, 213th, and 214th amendments that were passed by Congress and were enforced by the U.S. Handicapper General. That's how the story begins. And then it talks about what life is like if everyone is really equal. In other words, we get this equality of outcome. So it tells a story of a husband and wife. Okay, the husband is really smart. The woman she's not the sharpest tool in the shed. So in order to equalize them, the husband has an implanted hearing device in his ear. So every time he has a deep thought, every 10 seconds, a blood-curdling noise goes off in his head so loud that it makes him forget his thought. And his wife, who's not the sharpest tool in the shed, now they're equal. And also, the husband has to have 20, 30 pounds of weights put on him, so he kind of walks with a droop because he's in better athletic shape than his wife. So they can all be equal. And then it goes on to show, okay, they go to a ballet, and there's beautiful ballerinas with nice shapes and the whole 9 yards, but they all have to wear grotesque masks, and they have to wear all these weights on their bodies. And there's also other ballerinas that are ugly and are very clumsy, and so they're all equal. And it's science fiction. And I make my students read this. We just got done reading this, and we talked about it as class. In other words, that's equality of outcome. The only way you can do that is everything has to be in common. There is no private property. And the government has to get really, really strong to enforce that. Okay? And so a progressive view of it would say, yeah, that's not fair. It's not fair for certain minorities to not be able to get into college because of their race. We need to increase their test scores so that perhaps we get more of them in than the white people or something like that. Okay, so progressive Protestants would be more for that. That's equality of outcome. Does the Bible talk about equality? Sure it does.
We're created equal.
We're created equal by God. What else does it say about equality? Does it say something in Acts chapter 2 about equality? Where the church had all things in common and they distributed to one another according to their needs? Does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 8, when he's trying to challenge the Corinthian church to support the Jerusalem church, that perhaps we need to all be equal in our stuff? Is that getting at that? I mean, the answer is no, but kind of yes. No, what do I mean by that? The Bible never says that all of our stuff should be in common, and so you achieve equality and justice through government. What it does say is, as Christians, your stuff is not your own, it's owned by God. And within a local body of Christ, if there is a need, the body should respond with the stuff that's not their own, it's God's, and help them. It doesn't advocate socialism, because socialism is a government program. So when it says all things were in common in Acts 2, how do we do that? Well, you have to understand the context, and I think we talked about this before, but the church in Acts was the church in Jerusalem, which was a very poor church. The Gentile churches, Antioch is a good example, Corinthians, they were much wealthier. And so you'll see many times in the New Testament where Paul's trying to bring an offering back to the, because they didn't have anything. That was prompted by, that's why Acts 2:42, when it talks about they had all things in common, they were so destitute they had to make it work, but it was never meant to be a government policy. Right? And so in other words, we would recognize as conservative Protestants private property. Right? Thou shalt not steal assumes some stuff that's your own. God gave it to you. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It's all His, but they would say no, it's much more of an equality of outcome view. Does that kind of make sense? And that's a very big deal right now.
Yeah, because I've heard that. People will say, well, see, there was socialism back in the...
Yeah, and that's not true because, again, that wasn't governmental. That wasn't the state. That was the local church body out of a legitimate need in the moment many times. Right? Yeah. So, yeah. So again, they want equality of outcome. So equality would become ultimate, and things like private property would be secondary. Things like religious liberty would be secondary. Because if you make equality the ultimate, and now homosexual marriage is equal to heterosexual marriage, well, what if I have a religious conviction that that's wrong? Sorry, that's a secondary right. Equality is ultimate. So religious liberty would have to be sacrificed to this large equality here. And that's the emphasis. And yeah, okay? Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of? Again, justice is this idea that, again, what is justice for a progressive Protestant? Equality of outcome. So affirmative, you know what, we all know what affirmative action is, right? Yeah. You know, Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American man on the Supreme Court, in talking about affirmative action said this: you guys have been discriminating for years. Now it's our turn. There's another name for affirmative action. It's called reverse discrimination. You know, if discrimination is wrong in principle, then it's wrong everywhere. So reversing it is not going to make, you know, it's kind of like the classic two wrongs make a right kind of thing. Yeah. So I'm going to switch over here and show you something, see if I can get to it. Hopefully this will work on my screen. Maybe not. Maybe. I'm again talking about, yeah, there it is. Yeah. This is from the book that I recommended lots of times to all of you. Sorry, I'll get it back. Confronting Justice Without Compromising Truth by Thaddeus Williams. Did any of you read that or get that book and read it? You didn't? You need to, yeah. It's the best book I know about dealing with justice and how do we deal with it. Okay, let me see if I can get to it. But he talks about, you know, again, we're talking about progressive Protestantism. It tends to lean towards, well, it does, a worldly type of justice. And so I just thought this might help you understand it. In the book, Thaddeus Williams talks about biblical justice, social justice A, versus worldly justice, social justice B. So here's again, I thought this might help you a little bit, okay? Social justice A brings us to our knees before Jehovah as supreme and seeks a justice that begins with giving God his due, right? What is ultimate justice? Giving God his due. Because if we don't give God his due, guess what will happen? We'll stop giving other people their due. So take the Ten Commandments, right? You know, serve the Lord, right? No other gods before me, okay? But then if you look at the commandment 5 through 10, 5 beginning with treat your mom and dad, thou shalt not murder, no, okay? All of that deals with horizontal relationships, how we treat other people. In other words, if you understand this, you'll understand. If you violate the first, it will lead to the violation of the second, idolatry. It'll lead to using the name of the Lord in vain. You'll violate the Sabbath. And then, oh, by the way, you won't treat your parents good. You won't treat other people well. Okay? So that's social justice A. Right? Give God his due. Social justice B erases creator-creature distinction, displays the divine image, and downplays the divine image in everyone. And as with Jezebel turning ancient Israel to false gods, it lays prostrate before the false gods of self, state, and social acceptance. Okay, I would say the God of equality too. If you make equality ultimate, something has to be sacrificed, and a lot of it's religious liberty. Okay, social justice A brings unity by acknowledging our shared blame in Adam. We're all sinners, right? That's another thing about equality. We're all equally sinners. We're equally made in the image of God, but we're all equally sinners. We've got to acknowledge that, right? And so, again, Jesus destroys the wall of hostility between people. Social justice B leaves us in a state of uproar, breaking people into group identities, tribalism, refer to tribalism, telling the most damnable edited histories of certain groups, making every individual of that group an exemplar of that evil, and blaming our current troubles on them. The predictable result is tribal warfare, one of the worst ideas in human history. Right? And can you see that? In other words, Jesus said, you shall know them by their fruit. Just start looking at the fruit of social justice B that's practiced by critical race theory. Measure it against the metric of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience. If you've listened to those people, is there any love? Is there any joy? Is there any peace? Is there any kindness? There's none of that, right? Social justice A offers the fruits of the Spirit, right? Social justice B generates a spirit of mutual suspicion, hostility, fear, labeling, and resentment, right? That's anyway, I won't go into this too long, but it's number 4, champions a love that is not easily offended. Look at social justice B. Everyone's offended at everyone all the time, right? Yeah, and that's what goes on when you reject God and his way of doing things. You'll still, okay, folks that embrace critical race theory and all those kind of things, what they're trying to do or trying to solve is a legitimate problem, okay? Racism is a legitimate problem. Racism embedded in institutions is a legitimate problem, okay? However, they don't go deep enough and they ignore sin. Is sin an institutional thing? That's everywhere, yeah. I can think of probably the greatest degree of social injustice in our country, and that is called abortion. Huh? Right? And they completely ignore that. And the greatest amount of babies that are aborted are African American babies.
Yeah.
And they totally and completely overlook that. In other words, so it's like it's an attempt to fix things, but they miss things because they're not coming at it from truth. You know, it talks about this in the Old Testament, execute true justice. Well, that's not true justice if you miss things, okay? Anyway, I can go, you want me to keep going or you want me to stop? You okay? Okay, I didn't know that, yeah. So biblical justice sees evil not only in systems where we ought to seek justice, but also in the twisted hearts of those who make the system unjust. Social justice B blames all evil on external systems of oppression, okay? And so they make activism a gospel issue. And that's a big thing in evangelical churches, where social justice and the gospel are the same thing. It's not true. It's not true. But in other words, if you're not active in dealing with this as a church or as a Christian, you're not embracing the gospel. That is not the gospel, okay? Can it be an offshoot? The gospel is ultimately the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, and receiving that into our hearts to change our hearts. It is not activism. Now, can it lead us to get involved? Sure. Is there an example of that? Sure there is. William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist, right? In the 1780s, he was praying. The Lord spoke to him. He wrote this in his journal. The Lord has set before me two great objects: the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. So he did it, okay? But it's an offshoot of what God has already done in your heart, okay? Something I shared, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I can't remember if I've told you this before, but I had a student in one of my classes at Lake Michigan College who was a Black Lives Matter supporter, who was a Christian, a spirit-filled Christian, who had walked away and fell into the arms of Black Lives Matter. So we get to talking about this stuff in class, because this is one of the subject matters we talk about. And so he was championing his cause pretty heavily. I said, can we do a little thought experiment? And this is in front of the whole class. I said, let's say everything that Black Lives Matter is asking for is given to them by the government. Reparations, full affirmative action, full redistribution of wealth, full redistribution of power, everything you guys want. Would that solve the problem of racism and bigotry? And he said, no. And I said, why? He said, because it's a hard issue. I didn't have to say anything else. In other words, he still had enough of his Christian underpinnings and it was like in the whole class, it was one of the more powerful classes I've ever had, because it caused everyone to see, in other words, we would say, whoa, yeah, maybe some systems need to be fixed, but if you don't change the heart, you can do all this. Government can do everything. A full redistributive justice, and it's still not, because if the heart's not changed, people are still gonna, so it was a very transparent, candid admission, which I thought was pretty powerful.
Yes.
Yeah. Thoughts, questions? Anyway, just trying to show you a little bit of the difference between the two different kinds of justice. Okay, so again, going back to the progressive Protestants, Blackman would say, hey, the 14th Amendment is not limited to addressing legal issues to the freed African American slaves, for which the 14th Amendment was specifically written, but was also for every aggrieved group coming to the government trough saying, give me my rights. Yeah. Being a little playful with my language. But it's that same idea, is that, that means all kinds. In other words, whereas, again, Rehnquist, a conservative, would say, no, get your own through legislation and amendments. Don't go to the courts. Okay? Make sense? Okay. So again, justice is emphasized over liberty. and fairness involves the redistribution of wealth, okay? And so justice in the social realm is typically equated with an expansion of individual liberty. Okay, so again, justice for a progressive Protestant would be interest group politics. Do you know what interest group politics is? You've got the African Americans asking for their rights, and the homosexuals asking for their rights, and the Latinos asking for their rights, and the Southeast Asians asking for their rights, and the whites, in other words, and so it leads to the splintering or the balkanizing of America, okay? That is, another name for that is called cultural Marxism. Now, Blackman never said that. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but if you get to the point where suddenly now America is now divided, there is no American. There's a black American and a white American and a Mexican, if you start getting into that, that is very much cultural Marxism. That's exactly what Antonio Gramsci in the 1930s envisioned in a prison in Italy. He said, I know how we can get the West. We may not be able to get them economically, but if we can start dividing them socially, culturally, that's how we'll get a foot in the door and we'll split this whole thing open. And that's exactly what's happening in America right now. And thank God for the pushback. Every parent at every school board meeting, thank God for them. Thank God for them. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on this before I get going? No more? Okay. I'm going to skip over a few of these because we already talked about reproductive freedom. I mean, that's kind of old hat. We've talked about that same-sex relationships. We've already talked about that. Let's just talk. What I want to say about reproductive freedom, what I want to say about homosexual freedom, again, according to the progressive Protestant worldview, the federal government will have to get bigger. State and local governments will have to get smaller. Okay, because again, if you're trying to make that right for everybody, it straitjackets the states and local communities to make their own decisions. So more and more power is going to the federal government, okay? Children and family law, again, the similar thing. Again, if you notice the trend within progressive Protestantism, more and more powers to the federal government. Because remember what Hegel said. We talked about this. He said this in the 1820s when he wrote this. General time frame. The march of the state is the march of God in the world. In other words, so if you keep giving the state more power, that's God. And that line of thinking influenced progressivism, which we see the effects of it today. In other words, so more and more federal power. So if the DeShaney case, right? The federal government should get into the child care business, the child welfare business, the child abuse business. And remember, poor Joshua, we're all sad for the little boy, and rightfully so. But Rehnquist rightfully saw, if you go that direction, what's going to happen is state and local agencies are going to pull back. They're like, I'm not going to get the pantsuit off of me. And now you've made the condition worse. But for a progressive Protestant, they would say, again, federally mandated education, compel state governments to provide expanded services, free childcare, free healthcare, free after-school activity. In other words, instead of parents making the choice of raising the kids, it's now the state. Yeah. Okay. So again, we're looking. This is a thought experiment. What would happen if the progressive worldview continually dominated America? Government. It would mean generous support for children born out of wedlock, food stamps, subsidized housing, free medical care and a living stipend, more support for married gay couples seeking adoption. Again, it would, and you're going, wait a minute, we're there. Yeah, we're doing that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to end that for today, and we'll resume next week. Okay. Thanks, everybody.